Donald Trump is a propaganda merchant, and this little prophecy of mine with its 6 dates is a message against Donald Trump and others like him. He's not the only one today who likes to spin propaganda in the name of news while branding everything else as fake news. And a couple of the dates that I've flagged have already gone now. Today is Sunday the 28th of January 2018. And on the point of Donald Trump being a propaganda merchant, the proof is in the address he gave to the UN when he threatened to totally destroy North Korea if need be, and went on to talk about Iran, Venezuela and other countries that he regards as a threat, a problem. And he never mentioned Myanmar, which I found odd because 6,000 people had just been murdered there by the Myanmar military. 6,000 civilians murdered. Maybe a few militants in amongst them, but not many. If there were, I'm sure there are a handful of militant Myanmar resistance against the persecution, but nearly all the victims were civilians. A lot of the victims were children. A lot of the victims were young children who were torn from their mother's arms, in some cases, and thrown into fires to burn to death. What really gets me is that Donald Trump, when he addressed the UN and gave that speech, he never mentioned Myanmar, where that was happening at that time. The reports had just been all over the news in the preceding week. But I guess if you regard all mainstream news services, including CNN and whatever, as fake news, then you can just ignore something like that. It's perplexing because the Australian government also has not mentioned the plight of the Rohingya Muslims from Myanmar. I've heard no mention from the Australian federal government, or from any politicians in Australia for that matter. And if you're serious about combating things like bullying, whether it's cyberbullying or bullying in schools or whatever, if you're serious about combating suicide, if you're serious about combating domestic violence, then you're not going to ignore really, really bad human atrocities that are occurring in your part of the world. And Myanmar, next door to Bangladesh, is our part of the world. So there's a story in this little news segment on Myanmar. There's also a story on cyberbullying. And there's a couple of stories on weather events relating to Saturday 27th of January 2018, which was the second date that I flagged as a date to look and watch for signs in nature as part of this prophecy. Prediction, whatever you want to call it. The first date was the 23rd of January. It saw some big storms in my part of the world. Impressive lightning, especially around Canberra and Cooma. And there was a volcanic eruption in Japan, which threw rocks in the air, and there was a skier killed and over a dozen were injured. There was another volcanic eruption at Mount Mayon in the Philippines. A big eruption on the 22nd, which continued into the early hours of the 23rd of January. Then there was a 7.9 magnitude earthquake off the Alaska coast, and that triggered tsunami warnings. That was in the early hours of the 23rd. And a little later in the day, an earthquake of 6.1 magnitude struck just off Java in Indonesia, close to Jakarta, and that was centered in the Indian Ocean. So there was a lot on the 23rd, and yesterday was the 27th. And I filmed an amazing rainbow yesterday, the most amazing rainbow I've ever seen. And maybe that was a little celebration of the fact that Australia has now legalized same-sex marriage. I don't know, but it was a very impressive rainbow. And I guess one of the reasons why Australia's federal government has not mentioned the plight of the Rohingya Muslims is that Peter Dutton, the head of immigration and border protection, is also a propaganda merchant, very similar to Donald Trump. So he likes to demonize people from certain countries, certain parts of the world, people of certain faiths and religions. And I dare say the Rohingya Muslims are one of the groups that he likes to demonise and portray as being terrorists, even as they are suffering as the victims of terrorism and extremism and brutality and torture and murder. So yeah, I think it's interesting how all these stories are on the news today, the 28th of January, the day after the 27th, and there's something on here too about the Holocaust. And if you really stand against Nazism and the brutality of what the Nazis did during World War II, not just to the Jews but to Germans who refused to comply, and also to gay people, and I think the worst treated people in the concentration camps were in fact the homosexuals. So there was a lot of groups, including the Jews, who were treated horribly. And if you really are serious about standing against Nazism, you are not going to ignore atrocities that are every bit as bad as what the Nazis did in 2018 or 2017. And what was done to the Rohingya Muslims by the military in Myanmar is every bit as bad as anything the Nazis did. We're talking little kids being thrown into fires to burn to death. You don't get worse than that. You simply don't.
Queensland Premier will unveil plans to propel cyberbullying under the national spotlight. Anastasia Palaszczuk will reveal to her cabinet tomorrow her 5-point strategy that's ahead of a meeting with her state and territory counterparts and the Prime Minister next month. An urgent summit on the issue, along with emergency funding for frontline services, is expected to be part of the blueprint that the Premier will put forward before COAG talks in Canberra. The move was sparked after the death of Northern Territory teenager Dolly Everett early this month, and new statistics which show there was a 22% jump in suicide-related calls to Kids Helpline last year. And support from these organisations is available for anyone who may be feeling distressed. You can call the SANE helpline on 1800 187 263, Lifeline on 131114, or Beyond Blue 1300 224 636.
Wild weather continues to batter the top end as a monsoon brings heavy rain to parts of the Northern Territory.
And more heavy falls are expected today, as Sky News Northern Australian correspondent Matt Cunningham explains.
Well, it's not every day that you get to catch a wave in Darwin, but that's certainly what's been happening this weekend, is that monsoonal low brings wild weather across the top end. Even a sighting of a 3-metre crocodile here at the Nightcliff foreshore wasn't enough to keep these keen board riders away from the chance to catch a rare wave. But that wild weather has caused havoc across parts of the top end. More than 100 millimetres of rain has fallen in some areas in a 24-hour period. There has been a rescue operation that took place in Maracay, where a boat and a car were washed off the road. Police have also been keeping a close eye on the community of Daly River. There were thoughts that that community may need to be evacuated on Friday. That didn't occur, but police say the area is still on watch. They are ready to evacuate that community if need be, and an evacuation centre has been set up in Darwin at the Darwin Showgrounds. More wild weather is expected on Sunday as that monsoonal low moves across the top end. Police are urging people to take extra care on the roads with that wet weather in play. Matt Cunningham, Sky News, Darwin.
Yeah, it looks very nasty indeed. And Paris remains on high alert as the swollen River Seine surges after non-stop rain. All boat traffic has been stopped, keeping tourists off the capital's famous sightseeing boats.
The water levels are expected to hit 6 metres above the normal level in the next few hours.
Paris submerged. This was the capital's main river, the Seine, on Saturday morning. There have been days of heavy rain and the river is more than double its usual height. The weather has forced the Louvre Museum to emergency measures. Staff there have got ready to move some of its artwork and statues which are normally on display in the basement. The police closed roads and train stations as the water level peaked, but they say the worst could now be over. With the floods came some surprises. This was the catch of a lifetime for one city fisherman, a 2-metre-long catfish brought into the capital by the high water level. Others hoped to emulate his luck.
The flood is great for people like me that fish in the city, because you get fish coming to the riverbanks which never normally come this close.
The flooding has been worse in the areas surrounding Paris. In the suburb of Villeneuve, more than 1,000 homes were left without power, forcing some to leave. Local authorities constructed temporary raised walkways to help people get from A to B. Others used whatever means they had.
We've been clearing all the rubbish away. You can see there is a lot here. It's been attracting rats and things like that. And we've had to clean it up ourselves. There's not been much help from the local authorities.
Parisians have seen many floods before. This was the city in 1955. It was the worst flood in living memory. Back then, the water rose over the waist of the statue of the Zouave soldier, which locals use as a measure of how high the water is. This time around, it's made it up to the soldier's knees. And with drier weather forecast, it's predicted that is as high as it'll go for now. Katerina Vitozzi, Sky News.
The UN Refugee Agency is warning that at least 100,000 Rohingya refugees who fled persecution in Myanmar are now facing a new threat in the refugee camps of Bangladesh.
The monsoon season is due to start in the next few weeks, bringing with it potentially catastrophic flash floods and landslides.
Sick, tired, hungry, desperate. These are the latest Rohingya arrivals. They've been running for months and it's taken its toll. This, the world's biggest refugee camp, will be their new home. But after escaping conflict, more danger looms. Deadly rains bringing flash floods and landslides. It's hard to overstate the problems that could face this camp come monsoon. If you have a look at this slope, it's a perfect example of how steep they are. You can see here that the earth is already loose. If you just add rain, all of it will go tumbling down the hillside, bringing with it the houses and people as well. That basin would fill with water in a day of rain. Imagine the problems after 4 months. And on top of that, you've got issues like disease as well. And aid agencies here are saying it's not if people will die, it's really a matter of how many.
Protesters have descended on Michigan State University in the US in support of sexual abuse survivors of disgraced former American gymnastics team Dr. Larry Nassar.
Students and athletes have also taken to the streets demanding change and answers to why the abuse was able to go on for so long as USA Gymnastics overhauls its board.
A sea of teal standing in support, calling for change in the midst of the search for answers.
No more silence!
Hundreds of Michigan State students taking part in a demonstration overnight to support the more than 150 young girls, teens, and college students sexually abused by Larry Nassar, the former U.S. gymnastics team doctor who also worked at the university.
I have experienced flashback nightmares of the abuse.
Their powerful statement rocking the organizations that gave him access to them. Some of the women sitting down with ABC News.
It didn't have to be this way.
The fallout piling up. Friday, the MSU athletic director announced he's stepping down just days after the university's president announced her departure. The entire U.S. Gymnastics Board ordered by the Olympic Committee to resign, now complying.
There were at least 17 officials at MSU in some capacity, whether coaches, trainers, or at least 3 psychologists who received reports of what Larry was doing. Not a single one of them reported. Not one.
Authorities in Texas tell ABC there is now an investigation into the team's former training facility, the Caroli Ranch, run by powerhouse coaching husband and wife team Bella and Marta Caroli. It's there many of the girls say they were sexually abused under the guise of a medical treatment. Meanwhile, the Board of Trustees at MSU vowing to make sure this never happens again.
We're awful sorry for the trouble we've caused those poor women.
Survivors of the Holocaust have gathered at the former Auschwitz death camp and in Poland's capital Warsaw to mark International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Political leaders have used this year's commemoration to warn Nazi genocide must continue to serve as a warning to the world. US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson paid his respects in a solemn ceremony at a memorial to the Jews in Warsaw who died revolting against German forces in the doomed Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943.
Auschwitz-Birkenau was a place of unimaginable horror and tragedy. But we must remember what happened there and in similar camps under the Nazi reign of terror. We acknowledge the many survivors, the loved ones, the friends of those who walk in grief today. And we walk along their side, holding them up with our prayers and our support at their time of remembrance.
Okay, let's take a look at some of the front pages across the country this morning, starting off in New South Wales with the Sunday Telegraph. He wanted us to shoot. Exclusive. Police reveal cop attacker had death wish. The suspected pedophile shot dead when he stabbed a decorated detective trying to arrest him in a bar in Maroubra. Never intended to leave the pub alive.